You are having a moment. At least in my head, you are. Your conversations with Glenn Scrivener and Paul Anleitner were, in my opinion, some of the best. I thought they were really good. I thought they really brought into focus. I think, at least in my mind, they much better integrated for me your journey from it really your whole journey. I mean, you told your story well to me, but the truth is, the more often you retell your story, the more, I mean, you continue to process it and put it together and figure out how to explain it. So I saw your conversation with Paul and it was like, oh my goodness, he's covering everything. But then I thought, no, that's actually good because people can watch Paul's and we can sort of continue. And my thinking today is I want to talk to you about apocalyptic, both in terms of biblical apocalyptic, Christian apocalyptic, and what I see coming from you and really the game B people who basically said to what I think was generations of Americans who perhaps experienced familial or personal apocalypse,
Mhm.
but not civilizational. Um, and yeah, then your conversation with Jordan. Um, the Daily Wire portion was quite a bit better. You were quite a bit more able to sort of show yourself there, but there wasn't sort of the breathing room in that conversation, I think, to really um, pull that out. And I also think part of the way John Vervaeke's meaning crisis is heard tends to still be mostly
Mhm.
personal and maybe familial. It's domicide, but it's not cultural collapse. And what I see from
Mhm.
you is, um, and I'm not saying John doesn't see this, but most of the reception of the meaning crisis is my parents got a divorce. Christianity wasn't available to me emotionally. I got stuck in, I would say, pastoral care pitfalls, substance abuse, video games, other human, basically human shallow dead ends that people tend to drop into. And and of course, your story, I think part of the reason people, besides just the tribal fascination of why did Jordan Hall become a Christian? We're not expecting anyone to come back from world tours of ayahuasca and New Age communities and positive altruism and all of this stuff. You're supposed to be culturally ahead, and then for you to become a Christian is very retrograde. And so everybody wants to ask you, what? And then when you tell them why, the Christians are just kind of, well, I don't know if I understand him, but at least he's a Christian, so I don't have to think about him anymore. Whereas I think one of the things that I've recognized, I don't think you can read Paul or Jesus closely without recognizing in both of them the strong theme of apocalyptic. Again, it'll be interesting to know how much you haven't been around this stuff for a long time. And even though you're a smart guy and you've read a ton, there's no way you can read everything from 2000 years. A lot of this was sort of reduced in modernity to saying, well, Jesus and Paul expected Jesus' return nearly immediately. And so, since they were wrong in the ways that we're framing them or understanding them, we either have to sort of immanentize the eschaton or we sort of relegate them to have being, like you talked about with Paul Antleitner with respect to the the crazy man sandwich board prophet matrix that Jesus and the Apostle Paul were like the sandwich board guys that were like, 60 days and Nineveh will be overturned, and then Nineveh isn't overturned. And so you say, well, Jonah was kind of a fiction, and Jesus, he said a lot of really important things, but he was a little overheated, and the Apostle Paul was clearly bipolar. So so I'll just lay that on the table before you, Jordan,
Okay.
because again, I think, and especially now, this is the day after Liberation Day, and um, we're having sort of post-tariff announcement panic in many different places of the world.
Yeah.
I think apocalypse and the apocalyptic is now more available to people,
Aha.
but the approach again is, as I had in my video earlier this week, it was amazing to have Eric Weinstein strut on the stage of Ark of all places and rehearse what he's been saying for a long time in many different places. And then that in contrast to your story, because you're not out there. I mean, I'm sure building rockets and exploring planets would be just fine, but more like C.S. Lewis, you're not pinning the hopes of humanity on that, because what we carry on the rockets to the rest of the worlds will
Hmm.
be exactly the problem we have
Hmm.
right here, which is
Yeah,
what
quite.
Lewis said, in the 1930s. So,
Cool. Okay. Well, let's see. You have clearly been watching and thinking. Meaning crisis. Uh, Meaning crisis at the level of civilizational catastrophe. Um, Let me see. Okay, let me see if I could do two. I think I've got two pieces that are at least somewhat clear. So this is not obvious to a lot of people. Um, the degree to which the meaning crisis is intrinsic, and in fact, ever so slightly more fundamental in the larger category of the meta crisis than the systemic collapse that's coming from the objective. Um, so let's start at the outside and then flip back. So if you look at it from the outside, what you can notice is that there are ways to do something like complex system science on civilization. Um, and people like Tainter were some of the very first people to start looking at this and trying to think about it clearly. And actually, Carol Quigley did a pretty good job of that in a previous generation. And so you can say, okay, well, let's take a look at the outside. And what we notice is that from a diagnostics perspective, from the point of view of systems, our civilization is in the late stages of what looks like collapse. And notice that's literally what looks like typical collapse. We see collapse happens. It looks like these kinds of things. Oh, that's what we're tracking to across a wide variety of different ways of looking at it. Things like systemic fragility branching into collapse cascades,
yeah.
where try to solve a problem in one place. When you do it, you push problems to another place, but the other place is actually fragile. You didn't notice it. You break it. It starts to collapse. And now you're playing this weird game of whack-a-mole, but which every time you whack-a-mole, it actually whack-a-mole meets the Hydra.
Yep.
Um, and actually, if you don't mind, let me just kind of recapitulate the basic theory of the eschaton. And part of this is exactly this really weird spot of a purely secular analysis that leads to eschatological conclusions, and then how that sits inside the larger um, story in which things like telos and eschatology are even part of the nature of the story, we should point out. Um, so it looks very much to be the case that cultures and civilizations are different. Um, Cultures, and I'll use like the most sort of fundamental form of culture would be like an indigenous culture. Cultures tend to be able to be relatively stable. They've got a lot of pressures on them that selects for stability. But their stability is premised on two really critical characteristics. One is an enormous amount of context. They're extremely high context, particularly relational context. And therefore, two, they can't scale. You grow past a certain amount of people in the tribe, and the tribe actually forks, and you get what are in fact two tribes that become more and more distant as the population grows and the distance grows. And what this means is that um, one, you have interceding conflict between all of these different tribes because once they get past a certain distance from each other, they are ultimately like two peak predators competing in this in a niche.
But again, simultaneously, both conflict and collaboration. I mean,
Yeah.
and Gerard sort of puts that nicely together that anybody in conflict is also collaborating on both individual projects and projects between them.
Well, the amount of collaboration between two indigenous groups, say like the Iroquois and the Sioux, was actually relatively low, quite formalized, quite ritualized, for lots of reasons. And this creates a gradient, it creates a potency. And so what happened was that there was an opportunity for discovering a different kind of social coordination code, a different way of getting groups of human Homo sapiens to hang together and work together and make the whole greater than the sum of its parts, which we call civilization. I'm going to say hi to Paul, or is that his name? Kingsmith. Um, and civilization has the advantage that it can scale, and it has the advantage that it can be cosmopolitan. It can grab and stick a whole bunch of different kinds of groups together, which enables a much higher level of collaboration. And so the collaboration goes way up. And I've written a whole essay about the problem of the city as the centerpiece of civilization. But the basic insight is that we've discovered that this thing that on the internet we call Metcalfe's law, or the network effect, is quite unique in reality. That where human beings come together in collaboration, you get something like an exponential growth along certain valuable things like innovation and wealth production. And so, if you can find a way to get more human beings to come together in collaboration, you're doing something which is unique, very powerful. And becomes a driver, and it drives more and more people. First, civilization gets sort of discovered. It discovers that one of the first things it can do is it can take 10,000 people and conquer its neighbors who are limited to 200 or 300, and then ingest them into its formal structure. And then it discovers that as you concentrate more people into cities, you get these massive spikes in wealth and innovation. You discover all these cool things like the wheel and writing and whatnot. And you start getting what looks like a really cool takeoff. But the problem is the underlying characteristics of civilization, which I will not go into right now because it's a very long digression, are unstable. They have built-in fragility elements so that they are, as Schmachtenberger says, inexorably self-terminating. So you cannot make a stable civilization. It's just impossible. And so what ends up happening is you get this rise and fall dynamic. Sumerians, they rise, they fall. Then the Akkadians, they rise and they fall. And the Assyrians rise and fall. You just kind of get these continuous dynamics. Sometimes the rise and fall is local. Sometimes the rise and fall is the Bronze Age collapse, and a whole bunch collapse at the same time, largely because they had become interconnected. And so their interconnection allowed them to live longer than they ordinarily would have done so independently. But then that meant that when they started to fall, the fall accelerated it into a bigger collapse. And by the way, as a consequence of the nature of how mind works and how ideas work, once an idea has been discovered, it's relatively easy to teach and therefore relatively easy to transmit. And so even though Sumeria falls, writing doesn't go away. Writing now gets propagated out. Everybody else kind of gets writing for free. So the next reboot starts at, oh, we know how to write. Now let's learn how to do something else. All right, so you get this, what is actually in the field known as nested S curves. So each civilization is an S curve, but there's a bigger trend that's going on, which I'm just going to call capital C civilization. So you've got a given civilization, which Daniel may have articulated very well, by the way, to weave these two things together. But then you've got capital C civilization. Now the problem is, and this is where my eschatological, or my what we call practical eschatology, comes to its sharp point, is that there's very good reason to believe that we're not at the end of Western civilization. We're at the end of capital C civilization. There may be like one more civilization that might happen, kind of like a China AI robot thing that kind of comes out. But the theory is that those kind of the half-lives of civilizations actually decrease. Or to put it another way, the life of a civilization is measured in bandwidth, not in years. So as communication rate and population go up, the actual duration of the civilization goes down. The fragility plays out faster. It squeezes its life into a more intense spike. So whether it's us or it's the next one, the one after that is the end of capital C civilization. Now, this is a very big deal because we've been living in capital C civilization since somewhere in Genesis, right? Maybe Abraham, right? Somewhere very, maybe pre-Noah. I don't know much about that, but certainly Abraham, we're living in capital C civilization. And so that means order of magnitude, we're talking about 1,000 years is not the right order. We're talking the 10,000 year or 100,000 year kind of event. And by the way, having lived through what they call the 1,000 year flood here in Western North Carolina, I can tell you that you're not prepared for a 1,000 year event. It exceeds your expectations in lots of confusing and surprising ways. And so we're definitely not prepared for a 10,000 year or 100,000 year event. And some things to just kind of think about as characteristics of it is for the very first time ever, as far as we know, the whole world is entrained in a single civilizational matrix. And so when this civilization collapses, there's nowhere else to go. Now, Eric would say, let's go to Mars. By the way, that might not be a bad idea. It's just not the first idea. It may be the third idea. Right. Maybe the appendix idea. So that's never happened. Like when the Bronze Age collapsed, that was a lot of civilizations collapsed, but there was lots of other things going on. And there's a very large periphery, including all of China. And so it was bad and ugly, but whatever. But if this thing collapses, in principle, could be the whole world. The other thing is the magnitude of where we are. Right? The Bronze Age went from making bronze back down to stones for a little while. We're making spaceships, and that's a long way to go. And we've got like 9 billion people living on top of a substrate that requires very high levels of energy and technology and logistics. So as you start to move down, what happens is the carrying capacity collapses even more rapidly. And this creates reciprocal conflict, which is to say that people generally don't like to die. And so when it looks like the carrying capacity is decreasing, the ones who are on the edge of the carrying capacity will become increasingly desperate and, by the way, increasingly innovative, and they will bring it to the guys who are closer in, and this creates a downward spiral. Right? So you've got global and you've got intense at a very unique level. And by the way, I should mention, if you really want to be profound at the theoretic level, if I'm correct, that we're at the end of capital C civilization and we have no idea what else to do. Do we just default back to culture? Maybe, by the way, we've done that several times. It just kind of gets cleaned up in ice ages and we don't notice. And in this case, if we drop all the way down, that's a long reboot. That's a very long reboot. So this is sort of the practical eschatology, saying, hey, it seems like this is just where we are. Right? We can say intelligent things about the kind of systems that we happen to live in, and we can make some predictions about how these things play out. And obviously, you can't have certainty, particularly because this is not a science that you can do experiments on. But nonetheless, we were talking about these things 15 years ago, and we're pretty reasonably formalized 10 years ago and just watched what played out. And we're like, yeah, that looks exactly like we thought it would look like. So here we are. Okay, so that's the practical eschatology side of the equation. Now what I want to do is I want to go back underneath and talk about the meaning crisis piece of it, because this is where the rubber hits the road. And I think I can do this in maybe 3 steps. The first is I'll use a framework: society and community and communion. Society is what civilization builds. Society is what happens when you have a multiplicity, like a group of individuals, let's say, and they're held together by a bunch of extrinsic structures. They're held together by the rule of law, which means the threat of police taking you to jail. They're held together by various kinds of incentives. Do what we say and you'll get lots of food and lots of TV, etc. So they're held together by a bunch of extrinsic forces. But there's very little or no internal binding. Meaning if you turn off the external forces, they're all going to look around and be like, fuck that guy. And this actually happened when we were sitting in the middle of the hurricane. Everything turned off, And there was a 2 or 3 day period where we're like, wow, we're about to be out of food and water, and those are strangers over there. What's going to happen? Okay, so then we go to community. Community is where the relations are coming from the interior out. You actually have relationality. You know people. You know people for a long time. You care about people for reasons that have to do with intimacy and nuance. And therefore, for example, while there may be extrinsic forces, quite often you're actually resisting the extrinsic forces that are trying to capture you and turn you into a society. And if you were to turn off the extrinsic forces, you would just kind of move back to a default mode of community, which again, we in fact actually did. We dodged the society bullet, discovered that we in fact were a community, and notice how community operates. But the key thing about community is that you can't convert society into community. Community can be converted into society, and community by itself is not stable. Community depends upon communion. And this is, by the way, where we get back to the Christian story. So that's one. That's one piece. I just want to have that out there. The next piece, we kind of touched on it a little bit, but let me just play it out a little bit more. I'll do it in my first person. So you've heard the story where, okay, I accomplished a certain set of objectives or purposes that are considered valuable in our culture. I become rich, I become influential, I become whatever. Or I have personal goals. I'm going to build something and I built it. And I discover, which is many people throughout history have discovered, is like, oh, that's kind of neat, but it's not really the thing. All right. So what I do at that point is I say, okay, well, that's fine. I'm not interested in any of those things anymore. I'll just sort of retire into a very simple, wholesome life. I'll be a householder. I'll be in my community. I'll be in my, help at the school, etc. But here's where the real problem lands. For the most part, we don't actually have communities. We have societies. And you can't build wholesome out of society. You can't actually form real friendships. You can't even form real families. Right? The war on the family is not something that's necessarily conscious, but is definitely at the very base of what our society must do by its very nature. Because you have to convert everybody into the formal substrate of the social structure, or you might say the civilization structure. And this involves decontextualizing. It involves moving them out of the intimacy of microculture. By the way, generally for the benefit of producing more material goods.
Yep. Yep.
And we see this in our lives. We saw this, your generation saw this like crazy with the massive boomer diaspora where families just flew apart. Why? Well, I can get a really good job in Sacramento.
Yep.
Well, but you're never going to see your brother or sister again. Or maybe, once a year at Thanksgiving or Christmas.
Yep.
Like, that's weird. And it creates a weird sense of ennui, but I got a really nice car, right? Now you're in a weird spiral. So because our society doesn't actually have the fabric, the material out of which you can truly build wholesome community, even if you're really rich and really dedicated and really committed, like I was, what you notice is, oh, you can't do that with this. It's like trying to build a sandcastle out of dry sand and there's no water. Right? So you pour it out, it goes. So this is a part of my journey, was actually a journey of where could we possibly ever do something like this, and then we'll get to part 3. So that's part 2, which is, let me actually explode part 2 a little bit more. So as more and more people, largely unconsciously, experience the embodied reality of the lack of ordinary meaning that is available in modernity, their strategies, the way that they respond, start to inject into the civilization fabric what are ultimately highly destructive, corrosive, and toxic elements. Some will endeavor to solve the problem by means of inventing they'll want to go to Mars for reasons of feeling like life has purpose or whatever. They'll build pyramids. Some, of course, will go away. Some will self-medicate, but all of this is ultimately a fast or slow degeneracy of the underlying material out of community, out of which society is ultimately parasitizing. This is a variation, I think, on the cut flower story, but a little bit more complexity. So that's part of it is actually as more and more people move out of community into society, as more and more people move out of their local, rich, alive cultures into civilization, the underlying substrate upon which civilization depends is corroded and actually starts to become toxic in the interior of civilization. And then the last piece, the third piece is, okay, we've got a problem. How do we solve it? Well, I know how we solve it. Let's go back to the toolbox of how we solve problems. So let's go find the right tools and let's bring them to solve the problem. But the meta problem is the toolbox is part of the problem. So every time you go back to the toolbox, you come out and you make more problem. This is a really complex loop, and this is metanoia. The only way to truly solve the problem is you have to actually become a different kind of who. You have to change the nature of your identity in a truly fundamental way. And mysteriously enough, not randomly, it needs to change towards the good, right? If you just do a reset, well, I'll just pick a random identity. That's not going to get you anywhere. You need to have some mystical methodology whereby you cannot, by your own understanding, endeavor to address the problems in the world. You cannot, by your own understanding, and attempt to modify who you are. And yet you can, in fact, become radically transformed, but in a way that is actually towards the true and the good. I pose to you this is a very difficult problem to solve by any means that is available to reason. So those are the three. So this is how the meaning crisis comes up. And this now puts us on the threshold of the crossover point. So we take a look at it. Eric will look at the problem, and he and I have been talking about this since 2008. So we share roughly the same diagnosis. He initially put all of his hope on the institutions. We need to restore the institutions so that they can do the ordinary thing. And I said, no, they're already fucked, dude. We got to build something completely new. And that's sort of where we were separated. And I think he's largely given up on the institutions. So now he's like, we got to go to Mars. But by the way, in reality, what he wants is to say, what do I need to say and do to convince people to allocate resources to doing fundamental physics? Whatever it needs to be, I'll say it.
Yep.
But you can see this notion of going to Mars is an example of reason endeavoring to solve a problem. And it looks in the toolbox and it says, man, yeah, we are kind of screwed. This thing's going south fast. I know, we'll go somewhere else. Right? It's in the realm of a decent idea.
Yep. Puritans went to America. Pilgrims went to America. I mean, we've been, and Brett has made that argument too. As long as there's a space nearby that's got, less civilization than we have, in we go.
In we go. And this is, again, the point is, it's extremely rational. Like you can actually rationalize it up one way and down the other because it's the product of the best of what rationality can deliver. The best of what rationality can deliver is some variation on that theme. And by the way, the conversation, I've been parts of conversations, and you've probably read some news stories. I think Doug Rushkoff published one quite famously about 8 years ago, where he was hired by 3 very wealthy hedge fund managers, and they kept asking him all these questions. And he's like, what in the world are they talking about? And then all of a sudden it dawned on him, they have concluded that the world is coming to an end, and what they really want to know is how do they build bunkers that will actually survive? Right? Yep. Like, okay, that's a perfectly reason will lead you to that. Yep. Reason says, well, I want to survive, and maybe I want people who I care about to survive. And reason could say, and you really care about everybody, but you can't save everybody. So save who you can. Who can you save? Maybe these 12 people.
And so our prophets in Hollywood have been spinning off these myths and these stories for a long time too. All these dystopian, living in bunkers, et cetera, et cetera.
That's because they're prophets. They're addled prophets, which many prophets are, but uniquely addled prophets. And so they feel the reality, and they can't help but express that reality in some narrative way.
Right. And prophets are always prophets of something else. You have prophets of Baal, and these are prophets of modernity. And so their answers, their prophecies will be in the form of their God.
Nice. That's a very, very good way of putting it. I completely agree with that way of thinking about it. So, okay, so where do we go next?
Well, we've got the meaning crisis coming up, and I think because as we've seen, people instinctively have seen the relevance of the meaning crisis to the individual and the family, which is right there at the level of communion, which, as you rightly note, is the foundational level that allows community, that allows society. And we've seen that in terms of competing societies that are, right now, a big buzzword, high trust societies flourish better. And the reason they flourish better is because that underlying strata of communion is where trust fundamentally begins.
Yep.
And the rest of and that's where you get to pistis, faith, where pistis, in fact, is the underlying thing that allows the entire society. And we see this in churches. I see this in the collapse of my own denominational structure. You see this in the proliferation of non-denominational churches, because again, what churches are sort of naturally and organically doing when you have collapse, and this is one of the things I want to talk about at some point, because again, because of the prophets of modernity, we tend to imagine that apocalypse comes in one size, which it never does. Apocalypse is always scaling up and down.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're discussing here is the when you look at, let's say, the apocalyptic vision. Well, if the prophets of the Christian story that begins in Genesis and ends in the book of Revelation, you know, but that's the book of Revelation is built on the day of the Lord. So you have to go back to Joel and understand the Hebrew prophets in terms of the day of the Lord. And one of the things you realize very quickly about the day of the Lord is go back to Joel and you realize, okay, I'm reading about the day of the Lord. Is that a locust invasion or is that the Babylonians? And you say, oh, it's both. Because the day of the Lord, just like apocalypse, scales.
Mm-hmm.
But what you just related, of course, goes all the way down, because in the biblical story, communion begins in the garden,
Mm-hmm.
and it's the rupture of communion that, in some ways, as Jordan Peterson and others have pointed out, that the Eastern fathers have pointed out, the rupture of communion begins the story of civilization.
Yes, this is great. So this sort of let's sort of shift it into the next. That's the next stage. Like we just
Right,
moved across a really
right.
nice spot. Um, so within this new way of thinking about it, this new frame, let me recapitulate the problem of three, the third version of the meaning crisis problem. And what I'll do here is I'll use the language of image or the language of worldview. But worldview itself to me already sounds modern. I
Yeah,
like image
yeah,
better. So when we hear stories about the apocalypse, and we are relatively modern, we are watching a movie. We can't help it because we are dominated by the logic of Chronos. We think that all events at the end of the day are the kinds of events that the Enlightenment permits us to think about as reality. And then we're sitting our narrative on top of a deeper set of presuppositions. Does that make sense?
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so what has to happen is I have to say, well, okay, that means that the apocalypse has to be like a really super bad, you know, collapse to end all collapses. Okay, cool. And by the way, the flood has to, in fact, actually have been a single universal event because I'm actually assuming a historical timeline that is based upon an objective third person view,
Right,
and chronos, the chronological time, which is in context independent, like there's no
right,
context, it's completely just mechanical,
right,
is reality. So
right,
now I have to take the Christian story and put it on top of that
right.
frame. And this is one thing that Paggio has been
Yep,
masterfully
yep,
unwinding for,
yep.
whatever years. Now, if I say you have to undergo a metanoia, you have to undergo a profound transformation, a way of thinking about that profound transformation is you got to get rid of this image. You're going to be moving to a completely different image. And when we move to a different image, let's say for the moment we move to the medieval mindset, this is no longer Chronos dominant. Right? This is Kairos dominant. Right? The world is constructed of the fractal layers move like this, and there's many, many floods. Right? I have had several floods. I've experienced floods both in my life and I've experienced floods in my relationships. And there is something like I love the Jewish version, like shalom, shalom. There's the flood. Okay, well, there we have an archetype of flood, which is more real than any given flood. Right? It's not, we're talking about a particular mechanical, physical flood. We're talking about something that is more real, the substrate of reality, flood, of which all floods are an image of that
Correct,
flood.
correct,
And each flood carries the aspects of that image in all kinds of interesting, powerful ways. We can do
correct.
the same thing with apocalypse. Right?
Yep,
An
yep.
apocalypse is an apocalypse.
Exactly. And that isn't to say that floods aren't real,
No.
that biblical floods weren't real. It isn't to say that. You're just misunderstanding the way that the Bible talks. And this is, people have been plumbing that for a long time, because very quickly people want to say it's an either or. But it's like, no, it's not either or, but you have to understand your own monarchical vision in order to understand the sort of the false choices you're bringing to a book that didn't have those binaries to begin with.
Yeah. Okay. So so now the language that you used earlier about high trust society, low trust society,
Yep,
and so if you want to respond to anything that really matters, anything that's somewhat complex, turns out you need a high trust society to do it.
yep,
Oh, interesting.
yep.
Second step. Oh shit, we're not in a high trust society. It's going down. True. What do you do? How do you restore trust? Looks like it turns out communion is the deep substrate from which trust can develop. And this is, by the way, true in generally. Like you said, they're prophets and they're prophets of something. You can form communion at the level of an indigenous group with their principality, and that is real communion. That is
Yes,
actually something that creates real communion.
yes,
We have the unique problem that we can't do that. We have to, if we want to solve our problem, we have to find a way to form communion which transcends all nations, that intrinsically integrates all nations into a larger community that can do that, which is actually a really interesting thinking about as a design problem. Um, I know a guy, but we'll get to him later. So you start walking down the stack, like, oh man, okay, big problem. Need a high trust society. Don't have a high trust society. Have to get back to communion. But I can't get back to communion with a simulation of Christianity, right? Just a propositional construct that is in fact inverted image. Not only not only does it not work, it actually radically gets in the way.
right.
So for us to actually get into proper communion, we have to actually undo the consequences of the way that our current image separates us from the truth. And here I very specifically am making the distinction between a set of propositions that point to reality and a relationship with a person, right? Just that pivot, points us from a true story. Nope, we're not talking about true stories. We're talking about the truth. His name's Jesus. His name, he has a name. He is the name. He is the word. He is the logos. He is that which is the fabric that enables reality to hang together and be meaningful in its very essence. And we have to undergo whatever level of transformation is necessary to be able to completely exit a world which moves towards society intrinsically, to be able to re-enter a state of true communion from which all the rest becomes at least vaguely possible. Now, of course, as I'm sure you're very, very aware, once you do that, a lot of these other questions begin to drop out, right? Because you no longer think, I got to get to community, I got to get to communion so I can build community, so I can build a really cool organization that can build spaceships that can take us to Mars, right? Because you can no longer operate in a strategic mode at all. Because when you have undergone metanoia and you have, how does it say? You have sacrificed self. Then you notice, oh, well, the way this works is actually, I don't really make plans like that. He makes plans. I try to listen to what his plans are and I try to do them. So the whole approach shifts. And if you think about it, it's actually kind of straightforward. Strategy is very much part of the ligature of modernity. Modernity is an extremely strategic image. And we're saying, hey, that's like the last step of like the last slice of Western civilization. And what we're saying is that and Western civilization and capital C civilization are all going down at once. And we're moving into a portal that is in fact unique in history, and is of an order of magnitude, let's say, equivalent to the emergence of humanity at all. And lo and behold, if we move into this image, we notice, in fact, is exactly the same moment. We're living in a kairotic timeline, and
Mhm.
the Adam in Eden and Christ on the cross and us at the moment of the apocalypse is the same moment. It's a ringing of a single bell. Um, I can imagine this would be very disorienting, though, for everybody. It's very disorienting for me.
Well, there's a lot of bad news in there because given given the not only does every civilization, small c civilization, have its gods and have its prophets, it has its desires. And we would want the story of Christ to look more like
Yeah,
The
yeah.
story of Alexander the Great, who didn't tick off his troops and maybe get poisoned and die as a young man. His youthful death on one hand teases us to imagine the age of decay isn't real. Christ dies young, but again, this is where the apocalyptic is central because of course, in many ways, and as a pastor, it was so funny and do you think the pastor would be willing to come to our house and talk to us about God? It's like, do you know what a pastor is? Have you ever met one? No,
Nope.
obviously. But and I will say to people, well, this is Jesus' proposition he gives you. If you live like me, you will die like me, and you will be raised like me. And the difficulty that people have is the same difficulty Jesus' disciples had, which was three times in the Gospel of Luke. He says, everybody wants to know the future. Okay, guys, here's the inside track. Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to go to Jerusalem. And they said, we're listening because they're thinking, maybe it's happening. And then I'm going to be betrayed and turned into the hands of Gentiles, and they're going to kill me. And of course, they're like, no. And Peter actually
He's kidding,
says
right? He's
no.
kidding. Yeah, yeah, yeah. He's kidding.
And then the next thing Jesus says is, and in 3 days I'll rise again. And the most remarkable thing is that the only ones that show up Easter Sunday morning, which is their Monday, at the tomb are a bunch of women with implements to embalm him. In other
Yeah,
words, they could not hear.
yeah.
They could not hear the third thing. And that persists today and gets into, because just as you said, the Good Friday, the crucifixion of Christ, is this central thing, but it's always the crucifixion and the resurrection. But the resurrection is for us occluded in a way that that remains because, and that's where this faith is.
Hmm.
And people will say to me, well, it was, Jesus allowed himself to be crucified because he knew that he was going to be raised from the dead. And so I'll say, yes, what's wrong with you? And because Jesus didn't have Jesus before him to look at in the resurrection. And so his faith, the faith that was required of him as a human being, was far greater than the faith that's required for us. Because if you believe he is risen, then you believe you can take up your cross and follow him. But all of this, again, is the apocalyptic, because the thing that Jesus initiates in us, which I think is out there in our imaginary, is this sort of thing where you can love your neighbor all the way up to and including your enemy. And the other implicit thing that's behind our mind is, well, then we'll have some kind of movie soundtrack where everybody pulls out the potlucks and we're all friends and yada yada yada. But we don't believe that, because we know that if you love your neighbors all the way up to and including your enemies, um, even enemies in this real world, politically and socially and civilizationally, will be able to collaborate in order to kill you, because you have violated, in your schema, you have violated society.
Hmm.
Because society is fundamentally, it is both built on communion through community all the way up to society. But as you said before, society has built within it the death of communion. And so right there on the cross, you have the whole picture. And we put that picture in front of everyone, but
Well, as you said, like the resurrection is mysterious. Like I can get crucifixion,
yes,
right?
yes,
Like,
that
hey,
we understand.
they killed a guy really bad. You're like, yeah, I got it. I haven't personally killed a guy, but I can imagine that. I can imagine it happening to me. Got it. And then he was raised from the dead,
Right.
and you're like, what? Okay, I mean, all right, fair enough. I imagine a guy was basically stage makeup, but he wasn't really dead, you know, or maybe he was kind of really dead. But whatever, right? You're whatever you're already
Right.
doing, you're having to tell a story because it is by its very nature bigger than you, bigger than your capacity.
Yeah.
And so all you can do is surrender to it and then notice what begins to unfold.
And so, I used to, so when my father died in 2013. And again, I think you're exactly right. We, for a whole variety of reasons, just like, let's say, the preborn child cannot imagine life after the womb, just not within that child's framework. I don't think we can fully imagine life in the resurrection, even though we taste some of it now. And again, that's part of this basic layer of communion because Jesus keeps pointing to this communion layer and he keeps doing it in ways that completely frustrate people. Again, because the crazy thing about Jesus is he's more demanding than we think is reasonable, and he's more forgiving than we think is responsible.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
that dynamic is what gets him killed because both of those parameters are societal parameters. Because society lives on the
Hmm.
matrix of law. This, if you violate this, we will take away your goods, we will take away your freedom, we will take away your life. The power of the sword, as the Apostle Paul says, and mercy. Well, you did violate the law, but you're only going to get a speeding ticket, or maybe a warning, or maybe you lose some of your freedom. And so society is built on that dynamic, and Jesus comes and breaks it. He he challenges his friends, and he forgives his enemies, and I think what Jesus and Paul basically see is that that is the death of civilization and it's the lifeblood of civilization. I really like the sort of three tiers that you had there because it shows the tensions between them because you cannot have communion without you cannot have civilization without communion, but civilization itself destroys communion.
Hmm. Yep.
And I think this is helpful to see some of the tensions that I think Paul Kingsnorth stirred because what Paul I think did very clearly is he was able to in a very prophetic way sort of illuminate this tension of Christ which both builds civilization and destroys it at the same time. And that is where the apocalyptic comes in because again the day of the Lord is always with you. There's a day when my children will, hopefully, my children will all be around, and I trust they will, and they will lay me in the ground,
Mm.
and they will weep, and they will laugh, and they will celebrate, but that will be the end of something. That will be the day of the Lord for me. But again, the day of the Lord is this really weird thing in Scripture because I always call it a pre-echo. The the flood, flood, flood. The judgment day is resurrection day. I mean, all of those images in apocalypse, apocalypse, of course, means revelation. All of those images are just, they're like a singularity. They're all bound together and they're just going to explode and create the new creation. And of course, Christ, who is author of the first creation, in his resurrected body, is author of the second creation. He's the first fruits of the age to come. And so I mean, all of these things hold together. Now, I think last time we talked, we sort of ended with the crisis of Protestantism, which, in one hand, I think in some ways, Protestantism was sort of the next generation of society for the church. And in that way, you see Protestantism sort of, in order for the Orthodox to sort of live in the modern world, there has to be concessions to Protestantism. And same for the Catholics. And we've been in this process for a while, but as we've seen in Protestantism, there is, just like with society, there's the undoing of the communion layer
Mm.
because the Protestants, you know, they just keep, fractionating and dividing, and because there's the difficulty with communion. Yet at the same time, part of what launches the Protestant church is this attempt to come back to communion. Because the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, for example, is all of these people seeing the corruption, the end of the collapse of one civilization. And this is really, when I watched your conversation with Jordan, it's sort of recalibrating the language of apocalypse so that it's fractal without without failing to appreciate that there is a final apocalypse of but there's apocalypse all the way up and down. That the end of Roman civilization, Christianity comes in as late antiquity. You've got these successive, I mean, you could just see that the empire is coming apart and Christianity sort of comes in underneath it. And as it collapses, Christianity sort of absorbs a bunch of it. And so, and that's what makes the, that's what makes what's happening right now in our civilization, which you and Brett and Eric and many others are have sort of been working on. What's so difficult is that so often we expect to see kind of a complete collapse, but then it's sort of something mysteriously comes in and now with I think the second Trump administration, we're seeing a deeply apocalyptic moment, especially part of our culture. They've got the New York Times hooked up to their vein. Every morning, the New York Times brief is their daily devotion. And when I listen to people who are doing this talk, it's like, yeah, that's a religion.
And by the way, apocalyptic, because the end of the world is nigh.
That's right. That's right.
And he's got orange skin. It's very, very unusual demon.
So then I think the question is, and then when I look at let's say the orthobro moment now, which I think is deeply communion,
Mm-hmm.
because oh my goodness, ritual and ancient ritual and part of the beauty of the Orthodox moment is that so many of these churches are tiny. It's ironically like a new Reformation. It's just the 30 or 40 of us, mostly young men and young families, and we're doing this strange countercultural thing where we're doing the liturgy and we're reading church fathers and we're rediscovering and it's the heady days. But that's happening all over. And I don't want to take anything away from that because I celebrate that. And every time someone comes to me and they says, I've discovered the Orthodox Church and it's exactly what I need for me and my family, I say, praise God, you do that. You lean in it, you give them your money, you give them your time, you form that communion with those people. Please do.
Mm-hmm.
But it is part of this question of okay. Um, and what I really love about watching your journey right now is how I think because of what you've been through with your journey in game B, for many people, the retreat into the communion level of Christianity looks like Essenes in caves in the
Mm.
Negev desert.
Nice.
But you're not doing that
Mm-mm.
because you see the connection. You're not saying, as I think in some ways, fundamentalism, neo-evangelicalism, many of these Christian movements basically said, we're going to run into the desert and I'm going to be in my little Christian enclave and
Yeah.
I'm going to pray and, we'll fly away one day. But you aren't. And you're seeing the connection between the communion layer and the rest of the layer. And of course, none of us know, well, how's this going to play out? Well, that's what we want to know. But again, that's the modern,
I can tell you
that's,
how it plays out if you want. I mean,
oh, yes, please.
we skipped the end, but let me share with you a very rare. This is not something I don't think I've ever said outside of like a small number of conversations. Because you're correct. I didn't know. All right, let me just back up. Let's go all the way to all right. We have a problem. I'm zooming back in time and zooming back in our conversation. We've got a problem. Capital C civilization is coming to an end. All right. Well, this is hard to articulate, but I have to. So let's say that somebody comes to you and says, "I have um, a gallon of milk, and I need you to take this gallon of milk from point A to point B." And you walk up to them and you show them a cup. They will go, "A cup cannot hold a gallon. You're not prepared to solve the problem." You're like, "Shit, what do I do?" They say, "Well, why don't you figure out how to create something that can hold at least a gallon and come back?" So you fabricate a 1.5 gallon pitcher, you walk up, they pour the gallon of milk in, you walk away, everybody's happy. All right. The size of the problem that we are currently facing is, let's just say, 100 big, just to make it very simple. It's 100 big. The cup that we have available in the category of collapsing late stage modernity is, let's call it 12. And so we've got a 100-sized problem and a 12-sized capacity to solve problems. Well, what do you got to do? Well, you got to build something which is at least more than 100 in terms of its capacity to solve problems. All right. Well, this was relatively clear to those of us who were working on this thing 15 years ago, 12 years ago, somewhere in there. What does that look like? The language that I used, again, like 10, 12 years ago, is this term called collective intelligence. Now, what is the way that you bring a group of individuals together such that the sum is much, much larger than the individuals and much, much larger than the whole is larger than the sum of the parts. Um, all right, so we've produced a number of different techniques of collective intelligence thus far. We have companies, we have corporations, right? We have, and smart companies like Google are a lot smarter than an equivalently large number of people in 100 years ago. So we've gotten better at that set of techniques. We have universities where we say, hey, we're going to take a whole bunch of really smart people who are highly socially awkward and aren't really good at lots, but we're going to focus them like crazy. And we noticed if we do that just right, they can get this spike in capacity. Neat. Okay, what happens is we plug universities into corporations. Oh, cool. We can compete with the Russians, that kind of stuff. So we've been working on these sets of problems. Well, once again, what we discovered is that none of our existing designs, in principle, can actually achieve an adequate amount of collective intelligence to address the problem. And so you say, hey, we can build 12. What if we do really, what if we're really good with using all the things we know how to do? 20. Ah, shit, that's not even close. Re-engineer. This is where the indigenous stuff comes in, by the way. You notice that, for example, within a tight-knit, highly coherent community with tremendous intimacy, the generative problem-solving capabilities are much, much higher per person. The challenge, this is probably, I'm seeing a whiteboard from like 2010. The challenge is because you can't add more people, you get this huge return until you reach the scaling limit. All right. So, and as maybe a metaphor, think about the problem of the Manhattan Project when they're trying to figure out how to actually initiate nuclear fission in an explosive way. You have to think about how to get the right ingredients. Oh, I need this blasting thing. It needs to be the right shape. Like this is basically the shape of the problem. All right. So as it turns out, this is actually quite interesting. I'll fast forward all the way to the end and see if it just lands. Wholesome community of people who are living, doing life together, and are oriented towards, let's say, religion, is actually the correct kind of network to produce the kind of collective intelligence that can actually solve the problem. Right? It's weird. Normally you would say, well, I'm going to do the Doge thing. I'm going to do the SpaceX thing. I'm getting a whole bunch of autistic 22-year-olds and have them work 120 hours a day. And like, as it turns out, that approach is actually really good for building rocket ships. It's terrible for solving the kind of thing that we're trying to deal with. In fact, it can't help but make more of a mess of the kind of thing we're trying to deal with. Weirdly enough, as it turns out, having like pregnant women and grandmas and farmers and 4-year-olds and like 2 or 3 people who are of the kind of Doge characteristic enmeshed in a community of deep care, even though it may seem like you're wasting a lot of energy doing stuff like breaking bread and worshiping God together, this is in fact the minimum viable design constraint to produce something which, if it comes together in a larger community, which I'll have to get to in a second, can actually solve the problem. This is where I was, by the way, back in, say, Kauai, prior to Kauai, but back in Kauai. So we were trying to figure out how to do that. But we run into the problem. You can't force communion. Like, communion has to actually come under a single spirit.
Right.
And if you're bringing together a bunch of heterogeneous elements, um, there is no actual spirit present to bring that communion together. So you end up with something which, as the amount of load that it's trying to carry goes up, it explodes.
Right.
And
And
we're
and
back to
and the
Manhattan Project.
quality of the communion is dependent on the spirit that is creating it. It's not arbitrary.
Not arbitrary. This is very, very important. Yeah, absolutely. Um, and by the way, yeah, exactly. The quality, and as a derivative of the quality, the kinds of things that will naturally come out of it, because the communion is now doing the thinking. So your preferences are not going to be as relevant. Okay. Same thing happened when we went to Ecuador. So then we come here. So this is a different way of looking at the story of me walking through the door of the church. So I walked through the door of the church, and the part of me that's been working really hard for 15 years to design what is the proper kind of group of people that can actually be the sort of the seed kernel that will allow everything else to happen is in that church, right? And this is not obvious. This is not just not obvious. This is wildly not obvious. Like, why would a simple country church in Swannanoa that has, an ordinary slice of the diversity of human beings? I can explain it to you, but it's going to take a long time to explain it to you. But the bottom line is that's what it looks like.
Right.
And so what you said, this is not the Essenes. This is actually still 100% online with what appears to be one of the things that I'm supposed to be doing, which
Yes.
is how do we respond to this thing? Ready for the next step?
Yep.
The next step is the reconciliation of the church. We have to find a way for the body of Christ to simultaneously be constructed of local groups that are at the right level of deep intimacy with each other and with Christ, and also includes everybody. That is the next step. If we can solve that, we're good to go.
Which, oh, and you've read enough church history to know that
We're really bad at that.
I mean, you can start reading church history with the epistles of Paul and the and first, second, and third John, and and that's in many ways where sort of this tension emerges because okay, the and this is where you wind up with spirits warring because here's the if you read the book of Daniel and you understand what these beasts in Daniel 7 that come up out of the sea are, and you understand the 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 language of, let's say, nation and empire, which is the theme of empire in scripture is a really complex one because it's very sort of a simple way to approach it is to say empire bad, nation good. And you can maybe read that out of Daniel 7. But you're going to really be stressed when the Son of Man descending with the clouds is given an eternal empire. So it's like,
Hmm.
and you're right, I think. And this has been something that the church has failed at, struggled with. Jesus, of course, has this prayer in John 17 that all of his followers would be one. When, even right at the beginning, well, this really brings us back to the end of our last conversation because this is the, sometimes I'll call it the problem of wineskins, and I'm just starting to stop describing it in that way because the the truth is that you can have, let's say, 6 to 8 people around a table, and like in an estuary group, you can very quickly have a common spirit that holds that little group together. And then you can, let's say, have a group of 100 or 120. And at some point, you're going to have both the dilemma of proceduralism. I think part of the swing from the Protestant Reformation was you had the tyranny of the procedure, and it swung all the way to the tyranny of the propositional. And so, it's going to have to be fully embodied, but you are going to have the communion of the Spirit. And as anybody who has ever tried to, I've watched, I continue to watch Christians work on this again and again. And the truth is, it let me start communicating instead of just stop thinking. Usually, what happens to your little group of people surrounded by a spirit is it gets destroyed by another group of people that has better society, and
Mhm.
they kill you.
Yes.
And this happens at the level of spirit conflict. It happens at the level of theological dogmatic conflict. It happens in the physical frame, and in many ways, the Jesus sort of sets the menu here. And of course, it goes all the way from, let's say, the halcyon days in the book of Acts at the end of Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 4, when they held their goods in common and they were of one mind, and Jerusalem was just marveling at this moment of the church. And then see, this is what's really difficult, because God can't let God is always both the purifier of this and the creator of this. And you see that, well, you might say, well, didn't they have communion at Babel? Yeah, they had communion, and the communion built a building. And God said, we're going to confuse the languages. And then you have this communion in Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 4, but then you have Ananias and Sapphira. And did and what really bothers people about the story of Ananias and Sapphira in the book of Acts is it's such a small lie.
Mm.
It's such a
Mm.
small lie. And she drops dead, and he drops dead. And the church is terrified. And that again, we're back at the polarity of Jesus, more demanding than we think is reasonable, because it's such a small lie. It's a tiny little lie, but more gracious than we think is responsible. And the church has continued to work out, and to struggle with that ever since.
Okay, let me throw two things in. And I think with the second, I can also tell you how this version of this piece of the story ends.
Yes.
What happens after civilization? Um, so the first was something I've been thinking about recently, so I'll put it out there for your consideration. Um, we have a science called network theory, and a network, by the way, is the maximally abstract representation of a set of relationships. It has a node, which for us would normally be a person, but it could be a rock or whatever else. It's something. And then it has an edge. An edge is a content-free relationship. There's nothing in it other than the fact that relationship exists. And then you can load the edge. You can put relational qualities in it, but that's what a network is. Okay. It appears in the category of network theory, or in the discipline of network theory, that there are in fact exactly three fundamental topologies or fundamental kinds of networks. You've probably heard at least two of these: centralized networks, decentralized networks, and distributed networks. Okay? Now, here's the proposition. The proposition is God knew that. God created it, and he knew that. And so, if he's building something, the church, which is itself at the most fundamental level about relationships between persons, then it will discover and use the potentialities that are woven into the fabric of reality, one primary one of which is the triple topology of networks, meaning that we will have a version of the church that looks very centralized, a version of the church that looks very decentralized, and a version of the church that looks very distributed. The Lord actually gave us this when he pulled a select group of followers towards him and made them into what we would call in network theory supernodes. We also call them apostles. He did this again when he said, the only true center is the Father, but for you, Peter, and by the way, James and John, beginning of a pyramid, the Petrine archetype will be representing centrality in the church. And then Pentecost. Everybody's speaking in tongues. That's right. The Spirit goes where he will. It affects the whole field in a non-centralized fashion. There's no super node. There's no particular node that is more important than any other given node. I should point out, by the way, that as I investigated this when I started thinking about the Petrine archetype, I noticed that the story of Peter started to make a lot of sense for me. Because, of course, not only is Peter called forth as being, in some sense, first among equals, but he's also the biggest jackass. And he's also the one who must, by necessity, fall away from Christ more than anybody else, except Judas. And he's the one who said, he's the one who says, you'll deny me 3 times, and does deny him 3 times, and can only be reconciled by a second coming. From my point of view, the first second coming is Christ before the boat with Peter. And I suspect this is very symbolic about the relationship with the Petrine archetype, i.e., the Catholic Church. Okay, now one more step on this one, and then I'll go to Roman numeral 2. If you ask Vervaeke about something really interesting that we've discovered in late-stage cognitive science, and it's true in a lot of different domains, but he can speak about it quite lucidly. The human brain has discovered that the most effective way to use network theory is to have all 3 modes in a fluid dynamic relationship. And so the human brain can sometimes be very centralized, it can sometimes be very distributed, and it can sometimes be very decentralized. And it's constantly moving through these modes in a very subtle dance. And as it turns out, you can generalize that across most domains, maybe all, but a rich enough domain, a complex rich enough domain, that becomes true. So one might argue that the church, the body, will ultimately find a way to be able to show up in all 3 of these distinct network topologies in a fluid and still fully connected way. So a higher tone of communion that allows all 3 to be present and recognizes the strengths, weaknesses, and constraints of each, so they're mutually supporting. The Trinitarian echoes there make me happy. All right, so then the last piece. The last piece is really fun because what I'm going to do is I think I'll be injecting a meme, a term, into your world that I'm not sure that it's heard yet. Maybe it has a little bit, but the term is Bitcoin monasteries, which is a perfectly absurd term. And part of the reason why it's so absurd is because the gentleman who coined it, his name is Ardian, is Orthodox. And so a lot of other things he'll say are things like, ours is the quest for silence. And all symbols must fall. And do you still believe in intelligence? Because there's an apophatic necessity. But let's put it this way. I'm increasingly confident, and I'm actually writing about this. So I must be confident because I haven't written anything in forever. I may actually publish it. We'll see about that. I'm increasingly confident that the indigenous modes of culture, which we discussed earlier, and the social modes of civilization are prototypes of how human beings can be properly ordered. In other words, we haven't even begun. We've actually really just been testing a variety of not complete approaches to be able to establish the appropriate language, let's say, or Greg Henriquez specifically calls it a system of justification, to allow human beings to hang together in a fashion which is simultaneously stable and scalable, or you could even say includable. And weirdly enough, I actually do think that the thing sometimes known as Bitcoin, or more specifically proof of work blockchain, and this is a very weird thing to say, but why not? Because I think it's true, is a really, really, really important part of the solution. And it will enable a post-civilization form of coordination that will allow simultaneously human beings to operate in deep intimacy, in other words, the monastery side of the equation, is it will enable the emergence and the preservation and the stability and the compossibility of a multiplicity, a tremendous multiplicity of communities truly living in deep communion.
Hmm.
Now that's a heck of a fastball to throw,
That
but
is.
maybe I can write. Let me write this down for a little bit, and then I'll send you a copy of what I'm working on. You can tell me if I'm just batshit insane, but which is entirely possible. Um, but weirdly enough, Ardian, Bitcoin monasteries. I've been puzzling on that for a while, and then it finally landed on me about maybe a couple of weeks ago, and I've been working on it since.
Yeah, that is a fastball that went right by me. And because I mean, part of the difficulty is that I know enough about Bitcoin to know I know almost nothing because it's, and of course, mon so the monastic movement is so the monastic movement, everybody sort of understands. The monastic movement is a very strange movement in terms of its relationship with collapse.
Nice.
Because the monastic movement really gets going in late antiquity and sort of is this institution that carries through and then is in some ways just like everything else it's disrupted by the Protestant Reformation, and part of the problem is that it's not the Protestant Reformation certainly had a hand in it, but there were many other factors. Henry VIII, for example, before he becomes Protestant, raids the monasteries because there something about the system of the monastery. So all of these monks vow celibacy, poverty, community, and everybody sees that and they're just inspired, like they're inspired by Jesus. And so the thing that people do when they're inspired, especially if they're very wealthy and have a lot of guilt, is they throw
Mm-hmm.
money at it. And so while each individual monk is ostensibly poor, the monastery itself becomes astoundingly wealthy. And this actually is a pattern that you see with temples and monasteries that keeps being repeated throughout history. But, you know, the way the monastery, you can see how monasteries are these communities. I think that's the right level to think about a monastery. They're a community that is one of these so when the building collapses, but the building is just a like you go to churches in Europe and you discover, wait a minute, there's been 5 churches on this site, and no church has necessarily been completely deconstructed, and so the monasteries are like this little thing. Civilization collapses, but the monasteries sort of catch it, and they catch it by taking in the poor and by feeding the poor and taking in people that can't resolve the marriage crisis. So you're going to have men over here and women over here, and hopefully not anything that's going to be too destabilizing because that's what human sexuality does. And so you've got all of these things, but then the monastery then sort of gets taken apart. So and you're talking about I loved how you described the digital to Paul Anleitner. That was really helpful. And then your connection of the digital and the medieval. Yeah, I really look forward to you writing about this because that's something that's going to take me a little while to grok.
Well, the preamble of what you said, I think, is good. So what I would say is anybody who thinks they understand Bitcoin is very far away from understanding Bitcoin. So knowing you don't is actually much closer. Um, and I mean that I'm like 98% confident. There's maybe a small number of people who have something deeper. Ardian certainly is among them. Let me do one last piece for our Mars guys because I want to encourage our friends who want to go to Mars. And this goes back to a little bit of that notion of the 100 size problem in the 10 size cup.
Yep.
So one, if we're in a downward spiral, moving from a high trust society to a low trust society, which has a bunch of collateral consequences, we become dumber. The load carrying gets smaller, and so conflict begins to proliferate. You're not going to get to Mars. under those conditions.
No,
We're not going to get back to the moon under those conditions.
no.
You may have these very narrow spikes of Elon who can just like create a coherent point around himself and tunnel through it to a certain distance, and we'll see how far he can get. He may be able to break through and get, a couple of rockets to Mars, and that would be an enormous success. But that's not meaningful in terms of what people are talking about. But let's flip it upside down. Let's say that we actually go ahead and build that vessel that can hold 100. If you do that, you get Mars for free. A vessel that can hold 100, you get, and by the way, very practical, you in fact actually you get to move industry into the asteroids. So you're actually doing industry in space. And of course, if you're doing industry in space, getting to Mars is not a big problem, and building infrastructure on Mars is not a big problem. I don't know if you get all the way to the outside of the solar system, like do you get to past Jupiter, but you probably get as far as Jupiter in kind of the minimum viable construct that can address the set of problems in front of us. Right? 100, not 10,000, but 100, gets you that much immediately. And let me give you kind of an example. Back in 1998, 1999, when, let's say we, of which I was a member, were looking at the internet and trying to see what was going on, and we were imagining digital media, or digital media just began to emerge. The internet could just begin to do audio and then ultimately video. So what's this going to look like? Well, as it turns out, we correctly predicted the thing that became known as podcasts. We correctly predicted that you would have something that looks a lot like YouTube. You'd have something that looks a lot like Zoom, and you'd have something that looks a lot like Netflix. I mean, quite accurately, and that's because things can be predicted. Within the scope of the vessel called Internet 1 and Internet 2, those kinds of things you basically get for free. They're just a natural consequence. They're going to happen. And of course, the problem is if you can, there we can say is if I can build the vessel of 100, then I get all these things. It still takes work. Somebody's going to have to do the work, but the potential is there, and so the potential will eventually be discovered and unlocked. Flipping around, if the potential is not there, no matter how hard you try, you're not going to get there. So, to my friends who want to go to Mars, let's go to Mars. We'll be going to Mars in the context of a new form of post-civilization, which, by the way, has very weird underlying images of the nature of reality in comparison to what you think right now. Much better, by the way. You'll like this world a lot better. And you get to do all kinds of fun things for free.
When I think about your 100, I think about the story of the Columbian Exchange and the Americas, because it's really interesting to look at, let's just say North America, and compare the um, the mid-Atlantic attempts at colonization versus the Massachusetts colonization. Because I think to get back to where we started from, part of the reason that the outcomes, even though the mid-Atlantic eventually was successfully colonized, but part of the reason the history of New England, while by no means perfect, managed to survive, because again, if you read those early accounts of North American colonization, I mean, the attrition rates were just unbelievable. I mean, you read those histories, it was like, almost everyone dies.
Yeah.
And, in Virginia, once they discovered tobacco, and that was sort of the new meth or fentanyl, going all over the world. I mean, they actually needed laws. They had to force farmers to grow food because
Hmm.
because farmers didn't want to grow any food. All they wanted to do was grow tobacco. Whereas the New England colony, they were obviously religious exiles, and then but it was again back to, so if you're gonna figure out how to get 100 people someplace, any place, and I sort of come back to this again, if you watch science fiction, everybody's thinking, okay, for 100 people, I'm gonna want my engineer, I'm gonna want, they're gonna tick off all of the technology boxes, and the question is, I would think chances are, if there's going to be a colony on Mars, it's probably going to be a religious group. And they might be crazy. but
I've met them. They're really crazy.
but they're probably going to be a religious group, and there's going to have to be some other spirit that holds them together besides
Nice.
just getting to Mars, or I would argue besides fleeing because you think the world's going to nuke itself, which it might. And I want to be clear about that
Hmm.
because often I hear Christians say things like, "Well, God won't let really bad things happen," and I think, have you read any history? Have you seen have you seen what collapse looks like in terms of just the Black Death, a fairly recent one.
Right.
So
Well, I'm just having the image of like a bunch of Jews hanging out in Jerusalem in the middle of Solomon's reign, going, "Yeah, we're good. We're good." I mean, things can go up and down, but nothing bad's gonna happen. Skip ahead.
so, so no, that's a very interesting idea, and it's been so interesting for me, my 7 years, 8 years on the internet in a way that, I had the internet before, but I'd never used it like I'm using it now. I mean, in so many ways, it's been such a humbling and it's been such a humbling experience and also, disturbing. And, when it comes to and it's so interesting to me when I listen to you talk about this stuff because everyone expected me to come to the internet with a colonizing plan, and I really never had one. But the only plan I sort of had was a desire for communion, and so this strange communion that I've experienced on the internet, which has been looking to hopefully not while not dismissing the differences between historic Christian communities and the riches that they bring, because riches can very much be in conflict. To try and discover a communion that will help the various networks that we have been heirs to, let these different networks and different riches bless each other rather than just triggering all the old wars,
Hmm.
which at this point, in some ways, so many of these old wars just look silly. They just look silly
Yeah.
because I don't know. The more I learn about the Roman Catholic Church, the more I realize I have no idea what it is. And Orthodoxy is really a whole new frontier. I don't know what they are beyond what I know of Christianity. So anyway, I'll just have that. Maybe we're done. I don't know.
I think
Um,
we're done.
all right. All right. Well, thank you, Jordan.
You're welcome.
Um, I really appreciate, like I said at the beginning, um, I think your talks with Glenn, or those are the ones I've heard. You might have had some other really good talks with some other people too, but I think I praise God that you are in a new way, sort of in the Christian network, or at least you are more intelligible to Christians than you were before.
Mm.
And I think I don't know about how your old friends feel about you, but your new, I'll speak for some of your new friends that you're certainly very welcome here, and keep doing what you're doing because I think you're blessing us. And this is one of the funny things about God's timing. It's a point that I make often to people because it was something that I never heard anybody mention, that again, when Stephen was getting stoned and Saul is there holding the cloaks and the Lord opens up heaven, he doesn't address Paul at all. He waits until he persecutes the church. And then at the road to Damascus, then the Lord says, okay, now. And all of the families of the people that Paul persecuted all of the weight that Paul would have to carry for the rest of his life when he says, I am the chief of sinners. I myself persecuted the beloved body of Christ. Jesus himself had his hand in the timing of that and decided that the persecution of Paul was something that he would permit in order for the fruits of Paul, which could not have happened without Paul having been formed even by his rebellion, would then bless the church, all the way till today. So I look at you and I think, well, it's really interesting. God's doing something, and I praise God for it. And so I do pray for you, and I
Mm,
pray that God will continue to do His work through you. So what? Let me pray for you right now.
please,
I
that'd be
don't do that
wonderful.
often in my
No,
things, but and you can pray for me if you'd like, but I will pray for you first. Lord, I thank you for Jordan. Lord, what a Lord, why should we be surprised by the continual moreness that you show us in even common ways with a beautiful sunset or the birth of a child or the making of a new friend, that we should be surprised that you would call Jordan to yourself after this long journey that he's had, to a journey of so many things in his journey. And he knows far better than I ever will all of the ups and downs, the joys and the sorrows, the mistakes, the rebellions, the the ways, the things that in his life that only you know, and he wouldn't want any of us to know. But Lord, you have brought him through all these things, and you have brought him into your church, and not in a bunker sort of way that he's just going to try and save him and his family and let this world that you so loved, John 3:16 way, but he would join the church, and even early on in his walk of Christian discipleship, and he's just getting started, that he would bless your church through who you've made him to be. So, Lord, I pray that you would bless him. I pray, Lord, that you would protect him from the evil one. I pray, Lord, that you would be with his family, that you would bless his wife and bless his children and bless his little church. And Lord, I do know that in your preserving yet purifying way, you bring us all through difficulties and hard times, sometimes to the point that we, like your son, would cry out, why have you forsaken me? But Lord, I pray that his trust in you grows and that his delight in you grows and that you will continue to use him to bless his local community and also bless us beyond that. So give him your spirit, give him wisdom, and help him, Lord, to know that come what may, the things that you have planned for him are more than he can possibly ask or imagine. So hear my prayer in the name of Jesus.
amen.
Amen. All right.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Jordan. It's great talking to you.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Be well.